Hello, I'm Ndimyake Mwakalyelye sitting in for Vincent McCory today. This is Africa 54. Starting tonight, is an attack on the Syrian government imminent? Western powers led by United States are still considering whether to launch strikes against Syria following a chemical weapons attack that killed hundreds of civilians last week. United States Defense Secretary Chuck Hagel says military plans are being sharpened and U.S. forces in the region are, quote, ready to go if the order comes from President Barack Obama. We have more from VOA Pentagon correspondent Luis Ramirez.
Images of massacred civilians are raising pressure on the Obama administration to decide if it's time to get involved in the Syrian conflict. On Monday, Secretary of State John Kerry said there is little doubt the Syrian government used chemical weapons against its own people.
What we saw in Syria last week should shock the conscience of the world. It defies any code of morality. Let me be clear. The indiscriminate slaughter of civilians, the killing of women and children and innocent bystanders by chemical weapons is a moral obscenity. By any standard, it is inexcusable, and despite the excuses and equivocations that some have manufactured, it is undeniable.
But still, no statement of if or when the U.S. will respond with military force. With 4 destroyers positioned in the Mediterranean within striking distance of Syria, Pentagon officials are waiting for orders to attack. On a stop in Indonesia, Defense Secretary Chuck Hagel said the U.S. is examining all options.
We are analyzing the intelligence, and we will get the facts, and if there is any action taken, it will be in concert with the international community and within the framework of legal justification.
There are risks for the Obama administration, including political ones. After long conflicts in Iraq and Afghanistan, there is little public support for involvement in another Middle East conflict. For now, U.S. forces are positioned to carry out cruise missile strikes against Syrian government targets. Michael Rubin at the American Enterprise Institute calls that a limited approach, but he says there is a risk the conflict could escalate and spread.
The Obama administration is going to carefully consider the threat of retaliation, not necessarily just against American targets, but against neighboring allies.
Fears of retaliation are evident in Israel, where people have been lining up to pick up gas masks. The top U.S. military officer, General Martin Dempsey, has warned that any involvement in Syria could lead to an open-ended conflict. The dilemma for U.S. officials is overshadowed by the lessons of Iraq. But in Kosovo, U.S. involvement was limited but also effective. U.S. security aides say the Obama administration is looking at a precedent set in 1999 when the U.S. justified airstrikes in Kosovo by saying they were meant to protect civilians. Luis Ramirez, VOA News, at the Pentagon.
Well, joining me now to talk more about the U.S. position on Syria is VOA State Department correspondent Scott Stearns. Thanks for joining us today, Scott.
Sure thing, Ndimyake.
Now, President Obama had said that the use of chemical weapons is a red line that the U.S. will not sit down and watch Syria cross. From what Secretary Kerry said, this has happened. So how likely is President Obama to issue the order to attack? And then what does this mean exactly?
Well, I think it's clear that there will be some sort of U.S. response with U.S. forces in place for any potential military action should the president order it. The goal now is to build an international coalition to support what I would imagine would be somewhat surgical, limited airstrikes against Syrian military targets. Secretary Kerry has taken the lead on much of that coalition building involving European allies, including Britain and France, as well as the Arab League and Gulf Coast countries, including Saudi Arabia, Qatar, and the United Arab Emirates.
Mm-hmm. Now, what about the United Nations? Knowing the position of Russia and China, what is the likely position the United Nations Security Council is going to take on this issue?
Well, that's the question. Does the Obama administration go back to the United Nations where they know they will lose a Security Council vote, given that Russia and China have already 3 times voted against resolutions that would have applied some sanctions against the Assad government, and both Moscow and Beijing have come out warning against some unilateral military action. But Washington may feel that by going to the United Nations and showing the breadth of support for action, especially trying to capitalize quickly on the outcry over these chemical weapons attacks. But I think everyone knows what that vote would be.
Now, Scott, there are also these reports of counter-accusations. The rebels are blaming the Syrian government. The government of Syria is blaming the rebels. Any way to determine who really is at fault here?
That's the task up to the United Nations inspectors in Damascus. As you heard from Secretary Kerry yesterday, there's little doubt in his mind that the Syrian government is responsible. Syrian Foreign Ministry says that's inaccurate, that any effort by the United States to use that as an excuse, as a pretext to launch some aggressive military action against Syria would be inexcusable, and Syria is ready to defend itself using all means available.
And of course, Scott, people have been watching what has been going on in Syria for almost 2.5 years now, more than 100,000 people dead. Obviously, there's a reason that the U.S. in particular is treading so carefully on this. What are the risks that it is hoping to avoid?
Well, as you heard in that spot, a broader regional crisis is certainly something that the United States is hoping to avoid, and that's why I think you'll see a more surgical strike. Any retaliation against Israel, of course, risks drawing the United States deeper into the crisis. As you know, Bashar al-Assad's chief patron, Iran, Hezbollah's involvement there, it's clearly already a pretty broad regional crisis, and I think that's why the Obama administration will move both surgically and militarily and try to have as broad a coalition behind it before it moves.
Well, thank you so much, Scott Stearns. Always invaluable insights into these developments. Scott Stearns is reporting for us from the State Department here in Washington. Now, a planned